do we have, yes, Beatrice Costa, I saw. Okay. So, the last panel of our workshop is called Jewish Translation, Sound and Theory. We will have talking Beatrice Costa, Sarah Grabiner, and myself. I will start by presenting Beatrice Costa, qui est professeure associée à la faculté de traduction et d'interprétation de l'Université de Mons, où elle dirige le service d'études et de recherche sur l'espace germanophone. Elle a consacré son habilitation à diriger des recherches au processus de subjectivation dans le langage. Ses travaux portent notamment sur les liens entre théâtre et interprétation de dialogue, thème auquel elle a consacré plusieurs publications récentes en 2023 et 2024. Elle est également la traductrice vers l'allemand de l'éthique et politique du traduire d'Henri Meschonnic, publié en 2021 aux éditions Matt et Zels. Beatrice Costa va nous parler aujourd'hui de Henri Meschonnic, privilégier le mouvement du sens au sens des mots. Beatrice, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Cynthia. Je vais partager mon écran. Mm.
Béatrice,
Oui, voilà. Est-ce que...
on ne vous voit plus. On ne vous écoute pas non plus.
Voilà. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Oui. Est-ce que vous voyez l'écran?
Aussi.
Oui. Donc, j'ai appelé ma communication privilégier le mouvement du sens au sens du mot, ce qui est quelque part une provocation pour tout traductologue. Surtout les terminologues entre nous qui consacrent beaucoup d'énergie, beaucoup d'efforts au sens exact des mots. Henri Meschonnic n'en est sûrement pas à une provocation près. Aujourd'hui, j'aimerais vous parler de l'aspect complètement révolutionnaire qu'il a apporté à la théorie traductive. Ce qu'il apporte à la théorie traductive est véritablement nouveau. Il a apporté une véritable traduction d'ensemble, une véritable théorie d'ensemble de la traduction. Et c'est vraiment son apport original. Alors, je ne vais pas vous parler en hébraïste, ce que je ne suis pas. Je ne connais pas l'hébreu. J'ai traduit l'éthique et politique du traduire, mais j'ai fait appel à une hébraïste, Yvonne Domhardt, pour revoir notamment ma traduction des passages réalisés par Meschonnic de la Bible. Donc, ce que j'ai envie de vous raconter aujourd'hui, c'est l'apport novateur de Meschonnic et aussi ce que Meschonnic a pu puiser dans sa propre traduction de la Bible pour sa propre conception traductive. Alors, les traductologues sont confrontés à toutes proches, à des approches très différentes les unes des autres. C'est une discipline pluridisciplinaire qui doit constamment intégrer d'autres approches aussi parce que le marché de la traduction est notamment maintenant en pleine mutation avec les nouvelles technologies, etc. Je vous ai simplement noté quelques approches qui ont le vent en poupe, si je puis dire, pour le moment. Il y a l'approche sociale du discours, il y a l'analyse du discours, il y a la théorie de l'énonciation, il y a l'école genevoise, l'approche praxéologique, l'analyse du discours dans les études littéraires. Donc, une série d'approches possibles et imaginables qui ont pour objet l'analyse du discours dans le but de mieux pouvoir traduire. Alors, on a d'une part naturellement le discours traductif, mais on a aussi le discours de l'interprète. Et là encore, on a toute une série d'approches différentes, normalement, notamment l'analyse du discours interactionnel, par exemple par Catherine Caprat-Orecchioni, qui rencontre assez bien de succès, ou alors une approche moi, personnellement, m'a beaucoup intéressée, c'est le tournant vidéo ou multimodal. C'est une approche qui m'a beaucoup intéressée parce que j'ai filmé les étudiants pendant l'acte d'interprétation et à partir de la vidéo, nous avons pu tirer toute une série de conséquences. Alors, Meschonnic, face à toutes ces approches, il ne connaissait pas le tournant vidéo, naturellement, mais Meschonnic, face à toutes ces approches, a une posture originale et revendicative en même temps, parce que ce qu'il dit, c'est que toutes ces approches sont sans doute intéressantes, mais ne touchent pas à l'essentiel. Selon Meschonnic, toutes ces approches n'évoquent pas le sujet. Donc, dans aucune de ces approches, dans le domaine de la traduction, le sujet n'est pas évoqué, ce qu'il trouve tout à fait déplorable. Donc, ce qui l'intéresse, c'est véritablement le sujet en train de parler. C'est ce qui, selon lui, manque dans les approches courantes du discours. Alors, euh, il puise son inspiration, d'une part, dans la théorie de Benveniste, Benveniste qui a développé une approche théorique axée sur le sujet, donc d'une part Benveniste, et il tire son inspiration aussi de sa propre traduction de la Bible. Et le point commun entre les deux, si je puis dire, c'est véritablement la subjectivité, donc le sujet. Donc, il voit dans ces deux domaines, aussi bien dans la théorie de Benveniste que dans les traductions de la Bible, ou du moins dans la conception qu'il a de la traduction, il voit un référent important qui est le sujet. Alors, déjà, chez Benveniste, mais c'est sans doute quelque chose que vous connaissez tous très bien, euh, Benveniste disait quelque chose de tout à fait révolutionnaire. Il disait, ben, l'essence du langage est de signifier, hein. Donc, l'essence du langage n'est pas de communiquer. La langue n'est pas un instrument, mais l'essence du langage est de signifier. Et il rajoute telle est primordation originelle qui transcende et explique toutes les fonctions qu'il assure dans le milieu humain. Sa fonction ne se limite pas à la communication, car bien avant de communiquer, le langage sert à vivre. Et ce théorème-là, Meschonnic l'a complètement intégré dans sa théorie. Benveniste est véritablement le fondement de la théorie traductive meschonnicienne. Il s'identifiait entièrement avec cette phrase célèbre de Benveniste: nous n'atteignons jamais l'homme séparé du langage et nous ne le voyons jamais l'inventant. C'est un homme parlant que nous trouvons dans le monde, un homme parlant à un autre homme, et le langage enseigne la définition même de l'homme. Donc, Benveniste voyait dans le langage le lieu même de l'humain. Le langage est ce qui véritablement définit l'humain, et Henri Meschonnic y adhérait complètement. Donc, c'est véritablement que cette conviction qui traverse toute la poétique du traduire, et qui traverse également l'éthique et politique du traduire. Donc, Meschonnic a rédigé deux grands ouvrages sur la théorie traductive. D'une part, la poétique du traduire, et d'autre part, l'éthique et politique du traduire. Et on voit bien qu'il y a dans cette théorie d'ensemble de la traduction, il y a trois grands aspects, donc il y a trois grands piliers. D'une part, la poétique, d'autre part, l'éthique, et troisièmement, la politique. Alors, le deuxième la deuxième grande source d'inspiration qui a nourri sa conviction que lorsqu'on traduit, on ne traduit pas des mots, il ne s'agit pas non plus de s'adapter à un public cible, parce que ça, c'est naturellement une des grandes revendications des théories traductives. Tout ça, ce n'est pas tellement important selon lui. Ce qui est important selon lui, c'est de véritablement traduire le rythme d'un discours, et en traduisant le rythme de la Bible, il a véritablement essayé de vouloir montrer que lorsqu'on traduit, on traduit comme dit Benveniste, on traduit un sujet en train de parler. Alors, ce qu'il a fait dans sa traduction de la Bible, et en ça, il est véritablement novateur, et très, très original. Il a voulu traduire les théamimes du texte biblique. Alors, il a traduit d'une part les cinq rouleaux, hein, en 1970. C'était véritablement le travail fondateur qui lui a permis de développer sa théorie traductive. Et il a traduit d'autre part les psaumes. Alors, ce qui l'a fasciné, c'est le rythme biblique, ce sont donc les théamimes. Les théamimes étaient véritablement l'entrée dans la traduction de la Bible. Euh, il a attaché une attention toute particulière aux accents rythmiques de l'hébreu biblique. Donc, il a il a voulu véritablement intégrer dans sa traduction les théamimes. Il a intégré la musicalité, le souffle, l'oralité. Il s'agissait, comme il le dit si bien, de théamiser le français, hein, ce qui est très novateur, surtout quand on pense à toutes ces théories traductives qui requièrent à tout bout de champ qu'on s'adapte à 100% au public cible. Là, il dit non, 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 non. Ce qui est véritablement intéressant dans la traduction de la Bible, c'est de tamiser le français. Donc, il s'agit de restituer en français la dynamique du texte original. Il voyait en effet la traduction comme un acte poétique et éthique. Et à nouveau, se montre tout cet aspect novateur parce que dans beaucoup de théories traductives, il est question d'un traducteur qui s'efface. Hein. Ici, Meschonnic nous dit non, le lecteur n'a pas à s'effacer. Sa traduction, du moins quand elle arrive à restituer le rythme de l'original, la traduction est tout autant un acte poétique que l'original. Donc, la traduction n'a pas à s'effacer devant l'original. Alors, ces traductions sont originales, elles ont une tonalité singulière et en même temps, il s'agit d'une rupture avec les approches littérales ou purement sémantiques. Alors, les théamimes sont le véritable fil conducteur de la traduction des 5 rouleaux et de la traduction des psaumes, de la traduction des psaumes, pardon. Euh, donc, pour lui, les théamimes ont une triple fonction. La première fonction est musicale. Les théamimes donnent une mélodie à la lecture. Hein. Elle est prosodique, elle est syntaxique. Les théamimes avaient une vocation orale, donc ils remplacent la ponctuation, ils structurent le sens et il s'agit de restituer dans la traduction véritablement cette oralité. Il s'agit aussi, en tant que lecteur francophone, de sentir l'organisation des théamimes, de sentir les accents liants et les accents séparateurs, donc les accents conjonctifs d'une part et les accents disjonctifs d'une part. Il s'agit, en tant que lecteur francophone, de sentir les unités syntaxiques et sémantiques comme elles existent, comme elles ont été conçues dans l'oralité. Il s'agit pour le lecteur francophone de sentir que les théamines modulent la vitesse de lecture. Alors, c'est une lecture vivante et il s'agit pour pour le lecteur francophone de lire cette lecture vivante, cette lecture incarnée, de sentir dans la traduction qu'il y a eu un mouvement de la parole qui a été véritablement restituer. Donc, la poétique de Meschonnic, la poétique meschonnicienne est une véritable poétique de l'oralité. Il s'agit de donner une trace de l'oralité première. C'est une poétique biblique, donc la traduction fonctionne par le rythme et comporte une véritable éthique de l'énonciation. Alors, le texte biblique est en même temps, c'est ainsi que Henri Meschonnic l'a conçu, un événement d'écoute. Donc, le défi que constitue la traduction de la Bible est, selon lui, ne renvoie, selon lui, non pas à la question du quid traduire, le quid traduire est la question éternelle qui se pose dans chaque théorie traductive, dans chaque approche traductive. Que faut-il traduire? Est-ce qu'il faut traduire le texte de source ou est-ce qu'il faut s'adapter aux besoins du lecteur? Meschonnic a une attitude fondamentalement différente puisqu'il dit tout ça n'est peut-être pas si intéressant que ça, puisque ce qu'il s'agit de traduire, c'est véritablement le rythme. Donc, le défi que constitue la traduction de la Bible renvoie au rapport fondamental entre langage, pensée et vie. Il s'agit pour lui de se mettre, et c'est pour ça qu'il parle d'un événement d'écoute, il s'agit de se mettre à l'écoute du poème de la pensée. Alors, le poème de la pensée, donc il voit le texte biblique comme un poème de la pensée, et selon lui, le traducteur doit se mettre à l'écoute de ce poème, à l'écoute de ces théamimes. Il ne s'agit pas simplement de traduire un contenu, mais de se mettre à l'écoute d'un sujet. Euh, alors que traditionnellement, la lecture sépare souvent la forme du fond. Ici, au contraire, il y a une saisie du continu. Donc, le continu, c'est le poème de la pensée. Il s'agit d'un continu entre langue et pensée. En même temps, cette écoute engage une attention à la rythmique propre au texte, à ce qui fait que la pensée s'incarne dans une prosodie et dans une dynamique du langage. Donc, reconnaître le poème de la pensée, c'est reconnaître dans un texte ce qui fait l'unicité de sa pensée et de sa forme, au point qu'elles deviennent inséparables. Alors, cette reconnaissance est un acte de subjectivation. Et là encore, Meschonnic est très novateur puisqu'il dit que le traducteur aussi traverse un acte de subjectivation, donc rencontre avec un sujet qui est en train de parler. Le traducteur qui traduit le rythme du texte n'est pas celui qui s'efface devant le texte, c'est quelqu'un qui rencontre, qui part à la rencontre d'un sujet en train de parler. C'est une théorie d'autant plus originale parce que les théamimes ont souvent été effacés, ont souvent été ignorés. On les sent plus dans maintes traductions et notamment dans les traductions francophones. On ne sent plus les théamimes. Alors que Meschonnic en est convaincu, le lecteur francophone est tout à fait capable de supporter, si l'on veut, la lecture la lecture d'un texte qui est traversé par le rythme des théamines. Donc, pour Meschonnic, et c'est toute la critique qu'il adresse aux traductions existantes, pour lui, l'effacement des théamimes révèle une intention théologique implicite. Elle produit une perte du rythme, elle produit une perte de l'oralité et de la poétique hébraïque. Alors, Meschonnic a traduit les 5 rouleaux. Il a traduit également les psaumes qu'il a... Déjà, le titre de ce texte est très intéressant puisque il a appelé les psaumes gloire. Donc, il ne les a pas appelés louanges. Il a appelé les psaumes gloire, c'est le titre du recueil. Donc, il a choisi un titre hébraïque proche, puisque ce titre provient de Sefer Teilim. Le Teilim est le pluriel de Teila, donc le mot féminin venant du verbe Iel. Iel, loué, célébré par le chant. Donc, il s'agit véritablement d'une parole chantée, adressée, pas seulement récitée. Et quand on lit véritablement sa traduction gloire, on sent on sent à tout moment cette parole chantée, adressée, et donc on sent également toute l'oralité qui traverse les psaumes. Chouraki avait traduit par louange, Bouba avait traduit par Buch der Preisungen. En choisissant gloire, l'accent est mis sur la louange plurielle et vivante. Le titre s'explique aussi par les occurrences de Teila, il y en a 30, et IL, il existe 79 occurrences. Et nous avons dans le tout dernier texte, nous avons 13 occurrences de IL. Je me permettrai de vous lire pour clore cette communication, la traduction de Meschonnic. Et ce sera véritablement la fin de mon intervention. Gloire à Yah, gloire au Dieu dans sa sainteté, gloire à lui, dans le ciel déployé de sa puissance, gloire à lui dans ses merveilles, gloire à lui selon l'immensité de sa grandeur, gloire à lui dans le son du chauffard, gloire à lui dans la harpe et la cithare, gloire à lui dans le tambourin et la danse, gloire à lui dans le luth et dans la flûte, gloire à lui dans les cymbales sonores, gloire à lui dans les cymbales de Hourra. Tout souffle de vie fait gloire à Yah, gloire à Yah. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
Merci beaucoup, Beatrice Costa. I will switch now to English because we will hear a very nice English accent. We will continue with Sarah Grabiner. She's a PhD student at University College London, writing her dissertation on the creation and communication of meaning in bilingual Hebrew-English prayer books between 1940 and 2022. She's interested in matters concerning Jewish languages, the study of Jewish liturgy, Hebrew linguistics, and the linguistic nature of prayer. Her previous degrees include Hebrew Studies from the University of Oxford, Sacred Music from Hebrew Union College, and Linguistics from the University College London. Sarah will present her work on the importance of sound in prayer book Jewish English.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. It's been such a wonderful gathering. I'm just going to share my presentation. Here we go. There we go. Hopefully that's, if you just give me a thumbs up to let me know that that's working. Brilliant. Okay. So this presentation forms part of my doctoral research into Anglophone prayer book translations and the so-called bilingual Hebrew-English Siddur. Diaspora communities have historically been described as diglossic and their Siddurim as bilingual, with the spoken vernacular contrasted with literary Hebrew or Aramaic as the high prestige alternative. And yet we know that in reality, when it comes specifically to the English-speaking Jewish world, the majority of Jews have for some time been functionally monolingual. That's our disease in the English-speaking Jewish world, as opposed to this wonderful European gathering. So I use this locus of the diaspora Siddur to elucidate the complex multilingual environment of Anglophone Jewish life. And today I'm going to be speaking about specifically the importance of sound in prayer book translation. So here is the plan. I'm going to start by talking about the prayer book as a multilingual environment. Then I'll say something about the question of whether sound and meaning are considered to be in opposition to one another or as mutually supportive. Before discussing three aspects of sound in prayer book translation: transliteration as the prioritization of sound, the question of homophony in translation, and prayer as an embodied practice. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts about what all of this says about the function of translation. So Jewish prayer books have always been multilingual environments. There were minimal halachic restrictions on prayer in the vernacular all the way back to Mishnah Sotah. And even in prayer books without translation, Hebrew and Aramaic are interwoven, often with vernacular paratextual material. So to capture this multilingual environment, I've created this spectrum of prayer book language use. And what I'm going to be talking about today are the two in the middle, the orange and yellow dots. Prayer book Jewish English, which is a coinage of my own that I'll define in just a moment, to describe the language of translation, and as part of that, transliteration. And these are the two prime loci of language contact and of multilingualism, to break down the historic binary of the so-called bilingual Hebrew-English prayer book, which is not really bilingual in any stretch of the imagination. It's a much more multilingual environment. So a word about prayer book Jewish English. This is a lective Jewish English, which I've devised, having been greatly inspired by the study of American summer camp Jewish English by Avni et al. And I'll just note that I think Sarah Benor is in the Zoom with us. So some of the features of Camp Hebraized English, which that study defined, are really evocative of prayer book Jewish English as well. So the use of Hebrew as a specialized vocabulary, primarily nominal. The idea of a core shared dialect between many summer camps or many prayer books, which then has ideological variation in the prayer book that comes out as denominational or theological variation, and the symbolic as opposed to functional use of language. So I've adopted this as a kind of an analogy, and I describe prayer book Jewish English as something of a parallel lect. So some of the features of this translational language: we see great amount of language mixing with liturgical Hebrew syntax. For example, blessed are you as a verbatim translation of Baruch Atah. diverse Hebrew phonologies, which we can often tell by use of the transliteration within the English, and then standard English orthography and semantics. So as I said, I'm going to be focusing particularly on sound in this lect. Just a note about the corpus that I've been studying, where I've created this whole idea from. I'm studying 38 Ashkenazi prayer books from the last 80 years. You can see the details here. I'm not going to go into them in great depth, but my aim was to encompass a wide ideological variation of prayer books, and also to be able to look at the creation of public meaning across large praying communities, so books published by large denominations or institutions. So sound is often presented in the secondary literature as being both in opposition to meaning, but also as a kind of a vehicle for meaning, sound through meaning and meaning through sound. Glynner writes all the way back, looking at the 6th and 7th century, when Hebrew was no longer vernacular, that Jews accepted that the prayers would be recited for feeling rather than sense, and developed a zest for the chanted sound, setting up this opposition of feeling rather than sense. I guess I would put that as sound over meaning, perhaps. Similarly, and more recently, Jacob Petakovsky, who was a leader in the academic field of Jewish liturgy in the 20th century, similarly writes about this monolingual prayer, the non-Hebraist, looking at the Hebrew text, may see no meaning at all, he writes, but what they might see are the overtones of eternity, the intimations of a transcendent reality. Just because its sounds do not translate themselves for him into any objective references to mundane existence. I quite like his lofty writing. But he gives the example of the Kaddish, the Aramaic prayer, which has come to, quote unquote, mean quite a lot because of its folklore, because of legend, because of its association with mourning and recitation for the deceased. And this is completely regardless of what the words mean. The sound is what conveys the meaning as opposed to the semantically encoded content of the words. On the other hand, we find a somewhat different approach, sometimes even espoused by similar scholars, where sound is described as the vehicle for meaning, whether or not that meaning is understood. So again, Petakovsky writes, this time writing of virtuosic cantorial singing, of the sound of the Hebrew prayers as vehicles for their devotion, for the prayer's devotion, that the sound can actually communicate the meaning. It doesn't have to be in distinction to. His previous quote talked about no meaning at all. So we do see a slight difference here. In my work, I'm also looking to expand the field where we can get support and inspiration for this work, because the field of Jewish liturgy is somewhat understudied as a genre of Hebrew text, as compared with the field of Christian liturgy, where Christian liturgical scholars go into great detail about language and meaning in prayer. So Michael Hodgetts is a significant scholar in the field of Christian liturgy, and writes about the ability of sound to communicate religious principles, to communicate values. As he writes, liturgical communication is not merely the dictionary equivalence of the words on the printed page, but rather liturgy can be achieved more effectively, more profoundly, more satisfyingly by control of rhythm and sound than by archaism or imagery. So he prioritizes the communication via sound rather than perhaps what we might describe as content-based linguistic features like imagery. So to the prayer book Jewish English, and 3 aspects of sound that I'm going to discuss. So I'll start with transliteration. Transliteration, or acts of non-translation within translation, is the prioritization of the sound of Hebrew with English orthography. So I'll point out one maybe obvious point here, which is that in the pre-modern era, Jewish languages maintained Hebrew orthography pretty much universally. So a language could sound very similar to its co-territorial non-Jewish vernacular variety, but look recognizably Jewish. Whereas in the study of Jewish English, many leaders in the field have described a shift that took place where the language uses English orthography with Hebrew phonology, in other words, transliteration. So a text could look like standard English, but it's the sound which is distinctively Jewish. We see 2 types of transliteration used in prayer book Jewish English, and one of them is loanwords. So here I've just given 2 examples on the slide of so-called translations, which make use of a great number of loan words, who hallows us with his mitzvot, teaches us concerning the mitzvah of tefillin in the top example, and then the bottom, the mitzvah to study words of Torah. In the study of summer camp Jewish English, the authors identified two different categories of loan words. Jewish life words, well, that makes up pretty much all of the examples in prayer book Jewish English, given the locus of prayer book Jewish English in ritual and synagogue life. And then also words for when there aren't good Jewish equivalents. Good English equivalents. And this is where we get some interesting content. So this is a sample of the lexicon, which I've extrapolated from the whole corpus. And we see that there are some words which lack standard English equivalents. For example, there's no consensus translation for Chanukah or for Omel or Eruv. But there are other words here that are used with great frequency within prayer book Jewish English, where there are perfectly standard agreed upon translations. Sabbath for Shabbat, tabernacle for Sukkah, Day of Atonement for Yom Kippur. So loanwords appear with great frequency, even when there are standard English equivalents. So we ask the question of why. And my claim is that the sound of the Hebrew is a significant factor in conveying the meaning of liturgy. There are, of course, other already much studied factors that we can note: the ethnic term in Judaism in North America after the mid-70s, the influence of Israel, and modern spoken Hebrew. But sound, I believe to be a previously unemphasized factor, which is important to note. This we see even more so in the second category of transliteration, and that's whole fragments of formulaic Hebrew, which are left untranslated in the so-called prayer book translation. So you can see examples here of all different types. In the top book, the words are both transliterated and often translated. And this is presented as the translation, not as some kind of alternative prayer. So you can see either fragmentary or whole sections presented in both transliteration and translation. Or the middle book, which is a significant 21st century North American conservative book, where the opening of every single blessing throughout the book is left untranslated. Every blessing begins Baruch Atah Adonai in transliteration. Here, the translators or the editors seem to be conveying that the sound of the Hebrew conveys more meaning and is more important for liturgical meaning than any rendering they could choose, which would give some of the linguistically encoded content of the words. And finally, a very interesting Israeli bilingual book in the bottom of the page, Baruch Ayu Adonai, Maker of Shalom, which gives a kind of a fragmented, interrupted transliteration translation, clearly positioning this book at the extreme end of prayer book Jewish English in terms of the use it makes of the specific linguistic repertoire of transliteration, of language mixing of Hebrew and English. So the second aspect of sound is the question of homophonic translation. And this for me is an open question mark to what extent homophonic translation is present in prayer book translation. There's one book specifically where the paratextual material is explicit. Solomon Schonfeld, who's a mid-20th century British Orthodox rabbi, writes that he chooses blessed with an ST instead of the standard blessed because it's meaningful and euphonic. So you can see a couple of examples there. This is how he translates every blessing in the book. I don't know whether blessed with an ST is any more euphonic, as he calls it, or we might call it homophonic translation, than blessed with an ED, but it's an open question, and he seems to choose it for that reason. Additionally, in the secondary material, there's occasional references. So, for example, here in an article by Jose Four about delocutive Hebrew verbs, that benedicere, Baruch, and bless could somehow be seen as a kind of a family of homophones, a lexical Hebraism, as he names it. So this raises the question of whether even just that bilabial plosive, the consonant b, should be seen as having some kind of correspondence to the act of blessing. I think this is an open question for me in my project at the moment. This link between phonology and liturgical meaning comes to the fore with the third and final aspect of sound, and that's of prayer as an embodied practice. Marcia Prager, who's both a rabbi and a prayer book translator, writes a few pages of commentary about Baruch and the Bet, before saying we are invited to reflect upon all of this when we pronounce the sound of the letter bet, really centering the notion of liturgy as an embodied act when she talks about the recitation and how that's related to sound. This comes up in the Jewish thought about prayer as well. I think I'll skip this for brevity, but just to note that Stephen Kepnes is one example of a Jewish thinker who writes that liturgy is clearly about engaging the body as well as being a philosophical pursuit. Again, looking to the Christian academic literature gives us some really wonderful comparative interreligious work. Callie Hammond, in her book, The Sound of the Liturgy, writes about literal sound, what noises we create and absorb in worship, noting how sound requires physicality in order for it to be created. She discusses the comparative weight that's been paid to the content of the words of worship in the past. And I think this is true of the study of Jewish liturgy as well, that often it's the content of the words that's studied as opposed to their experience or their sound. She writes, of course, the rational power and factual content make their mark, but the most sublime power of the words lies in the act of performing them. The embodied act of liturgy is directly related to the sounds we make in worship, and also the sounds that are, as she says, absorbed or heard. So to bring this together in conclusion, we have the question of the function of translation, the function of prayer book Jewish English. Some books, and many might assume that translation is in a prayer book in order to provide a pedagogic, educative function, understanding. If we just look at the bottom quotation here, it's a advert for the Art Scroll catalogue, which first started publishing bilingual books in the 80s. Do you wish you could pray in Hebrew and understand what you're saying as you're saying it? The translation is clearly subordinated to a Hebrew source text. It's there to support Hebrew prayer. In distinction to that, we have books which make explicit that the prayer book Jewish English is a devotional text, as we see in the top quote here. And I hope that with my presentation today, I've contributed to that understanding that prayer book Jewish English, through its use of sound, should in fact be considered a liturgical language and should in fact be considered as creating a sacred text, creating a text for prayer, a liturgy in and of itself. This is, as I said, just a piece of my project, and I hope to expand more upon it as I, please God, move towards completion. But the facet of sound in prayer book Jewish English and the treating of the English of Jewish prayer, not as a subordinated secondary language to a Hebrew source text, but rather as a full sacred liturgical language in and of itself, is something that I hope to continue to explore. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for the presentation.
Maia, sorry, before you present me, I realize now that I can, unless I'm wrong, that I cannot show, actually, I don't know how to do that. My presentation at the same time I'm reading my words. Is that possible to read at the same time I pass through my presentation? Anyway, so I am sending it to you.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, I send it already to the email of JewishTranslation. Okay.
Just a second. Okay.
So Maia will present me, and this is the last panel, the last presentation. To close, I prepare a very short text that not analyzes, but concludes or reacts to everything I heard during this last 2 days is very short, but I would like you to hear it. So this will come after my presentation now, which is related specifically to my DFG project. ¿Lo encontraste?
Sí, pero es muy pesado, no me deja descargarlo.
Okay. Someone knows how to read at the same time that I present my PowerPoint?
You have to split your screen.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Paloma. I don't know how to do that. Yeah, sorry.
I'm trying, but it's not working. I can't even open it.
Okay, I think I can manage. I will try to.
Yeah.
I mean, I will open and close, I think. Do you see now my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so preséntame y empiezo.
Okay. So I will now present the last speaker of this panel and also organizer of this workshop. Cynthia Gabbay es investigadora en el Instituto de Historia Cultural y Teoría de la Universidad Humboldt de Berlín, donde trabaja en su proyecto La Biblioteca Judía en Argentina, proyecto DFG 2022-2025. En este contexto fundó la Red para el Estudio de la Traducción Judía y el Multilingüismo en la Edad Moderna y Contemporánea y coordina el blog de divulgación científica Trujamanes y Poligloterías, Pergaminos para pensar la traducción y el multilingüismo judaicos. Asimismo, se encuentra escribiendo su habilitación en el laboratorio Remelis de la Universidad de Orleans. Es autora de Los ríos metafísicos de Julio Cortázar, de La lírica al diálogo, 2015, y ha editado el volumen Jewish Imaginaries of the Spanish Civil War, In Search of Poetic Justice, 2022. Es coeditora de Lingua Franca y editora en jefe de la serie editorial Research in Latin American Jewish Studies, en representación del AXA. Además, es poeta multilingüe y traductora de lenguas judías y romances. Her presentation is titled The Versatility of Jewish Translation as Literary Genre in the Work of Carlos M. Grünberg.
Okay, thank you, Maia. So I will alternate between both documents. I'm sorry about this. I didn't think about this before. Okay, so etymology, sound, rhythm. Carlos Moisés Grünberg, the most emblematic Jewish poet from Argentina, and the translator who inspired both the conception of my current project and the very existence of this entire workshop, had a favorite moment of the day. He would go to bed accompanied by the most fascinating of books, which he read with meticulous care, a 1939 edition of the Diccionario de la Real Academia Española, which he kept on his mesita de luz, his nightstand, literally and symbolically his little table of light. His dictionary, which I had the immense fortune to examine just a few months ago alongside his now departed son Daniel Zichrono Livracha, was more than a book to Grünberg. To read it meant to explore word by word in alphabetical order the vast Spanish universe of meanings and significances. So many words were marked and annotated, so many of them deserved a thinking, a marginal, though centrifugal thought, that his dictionary appeared to me truly as an initial Talmudic territory of commentary and debate. It is across the surface of this dictionary that one can truly measure the passion and extraordinary need that Carlos Moisés Grünberg projected onto language. He knew that everything was there, the past and the present, the ongoing and the future, and yet his most ardent interest lay in Hebraic etymologies. Carlos Moises discovered, more than the most important Hispanic philologists of the 20th century, dozens of Hebraic etymologies hidden in the Spanish language. Crypto-Hebraism, he called them. His etymological explorations helped him to broaden his intimacy with language, a safe space, a territory of resistance against a world of fascism, sorrow, and violence. Humasha he rescued from the waters of oblivion a Hebraic Spanish, one that slips beneath the Hispanic coin. Grünberg's relation with words truly developed into an archaeology of language, unveiling the past of what seemed to him a lost paradise, where Semitic roots acted as codes and lighthouses, illuminating his path to understanding and deploying his own identity. All this can be observed not only on the skin of the pages of his dictionary, but also in his 1937 essay, Hebraísmos y criptohebraísmos en el romance peninsular y americano, an essay devoted to discussing the hidden Hebrew etymologies in Spanish. This act could perhaps be understood as the inverse of the calque method used in Ladinar practices in medieval Spain, where the Melamdim translated Hebrew sacred texts into the Romance language for didactic purposes. But there is no symmetry in this action. There is no way back to Tannahic Hebrew. When Grünberg searched for those Hebraic origins, he realized that they had never disappeared. In a way, from a narrow Semitic perspective, though not far from the truth, he understood that Spanish can be read as Ladino, meaning that Hebrew is still alive inside Spanish. Through complex historical processes we might not fully grasp, Hebrew remained in Spanish long after the Jews were expelled from Sepharad, perhaps because not all of them were. Conversos and marranos actually stayed, and their learning practices of the Hebrew sacred texts persisted clandestinely. Rescuing Hebrew roots from the dark waters of modernity, perhaps in 1937, but also in 1940, when he published his third poetic anthology, Mester de Judería, and again in 1945, when he completed his translation of the Pesach Haggadah, La Narración de la Pascua, into Hebraic Spanish, a written language that could also be described as Neo-Sephardic or even as a Judeo-Spanish imposture. This act of rescue amounted to forcing a short circuit between times, a poetic ritual to exorcise his contemporary barbarians. While La Narración de la Pascua was one of his last translations, completed in 1946, his translated corpus reveals the range of translatological tools he adopted. I will briefly present them and offer a few reflections on the versatility of his choices. Between 1936 and 1958, especially during the Shoah, Carlos Moises Grünberg translated works by Heinrich Heine, Umberto Saba, David Pazmanik, Yehuda Magnes, H. Leivik, and Shlomo Ibn Gabirol. He also ventured into Hebrew sources such as the Haggadah, the Psalms, and a few chapters of Bereshit. His interest in the Sephardic world was expressed through both his imaginaire and the calque translation method he employed, particularly for traditional texts. The table here presents a list of translated Jewish texts. These include works originally written in Jewish languages, such as Hebrew, Aramaic, or Yiddish, as well as texts in European languages like German, French, English, or Italian, authored by Jewish writers and addressing Jewish topics or experiences. Translation enabled Grünberg to engage with his contemporaries through political writings, such as those of Magnes, Pazmanik, and Leivik, and to revisit the cultural and political significance of traditional Jewish texts in the modern era. Although I do not have time to examine all of these translations in detail, I can broadly affirm that Grünberg approached each with distinct perspectives and translation strategies, thereby crafting a unique poetics of translation. His practice reveals a phenomenological approach, adapting his method to suit each text, resulting in a remarkable versatility that shaped both his identity as a translator and his broader intellectual profile. I will briefly present 4 examples to illustrate the significance of this versatility. Even so, one consistent feature stands out across all Grünberg's translations: a focus on rhythm, cadence, and sound as guiding principles, much like what Henri Meschonnic would later describe and undertake in his own theory and practice of translation. This is especially evident in Grünberg's etymological translations, where he paid particular attention to preserving the sound of Hebrew consonants in Spanish. As for the first example, the example of Bereshit 1 and 2, do you see my images properly? Maia? Do you see the PowerPoint?
First line of the title, it's not being showed.
Oh, okay. I don't know why. Now, yes. So regarding the first example, translated in 1946, the year in which Grünberg produced many of his translations in response to the annihilation of 6 million of his fellow Jews, bearers of Jewish tradition and literature. This translation demonstrates his deep knowledge of and experience with the calque method. In this image, I marked in purple words that are unusual in contemporary Spanish and produce an archaizing effect. In blue, I underlined an instant of hyperbolization or over-connotation, a rare occurrence in Grünberg's work, as he generally shows a fervor for precision. And finally, in green, I marked the calque translations, which, with a few exceptions, are not as precise as those found in his translation of the Haggadah. The second example, which I will show immediately, the second example also relates to a traditional text, the Pesach Haggadah, La Narración de la Pascua, which Grünberg translated during the final year of the war and published in 1946. This stands as his most important translation, both in terms of creativity and ampleur, a true work of craftsmanship in calque and etymological translation. This last one consists first in the identification of Hebrew linguistic roots, then in the decoding of crypto-Hebraism in the Spanish word, or alternatively, in cases where no crypto-Hebraism is found, in searching for the etymological root of the word equivalent to Hebrew in Spanish. An example of category A, I also have an image for that. An example of category A, when translating the plural noun Bnei Chorim from Aramaic in English, liberated people, the translator uses the word horros, a disused term in Spanish that was archaically pronounced with an aspired Horro in Spanish means exactly the same as the singular noun bar jorim, a liberated person, following the Real Academia Española de la Lengua's definition about a person who, I'm quoting, having been a slave acquires freedom, dicho de una persona que habiendo sido esclava alcanza la libertad. Moreover, Horro and Bar Jorim share the same Aramaic and Hebraic root, Het Resh Resh, one that has its equivalent also in Arabic. This means that it is highly probable that horro is a crypto-Hebraic word, another one to add to Grünberg's 1937 list. An example for an etymological translation of the second degree, which makes the translator's choice unusual, is that of regificarán instead of coronarán, yamlihu, for he will crown. Since the verb in future tense yamlihu belongs to the root melech, mem lamed chaf, also king, Grünberg used the related Latin root rex, rey in Spanish, to build the new verb regificar. While the word does not exist in contemporary Spanish, the root appears in words such as regio, an adjective derived from rey or regir, to govern. As a third example, I present the translation of Unter der gelben Latte, a Wig Lied by Leivik, translated by Grünberg in 1946. This Yiddish poem, rendered in English as Under the Yellow Patch Lullaby, features several notable translation choices. In red, the word yacente appears, an unusual but legitimate expression in Spanish, used here to preserve the sound repetition of the Yiddish verb liegen, liegt, bleibt liegen, which refers to the father's death. This repetition, notably, is not preserved in the English translation. In yellow, Grünberg inverts a pair of lines to produce a more fluid rhythm in Spanish. And in purple, he uses a very unusual expression that adds an archaizing tone to the text. The fourth and last example is taken from the 38th stanza of Keter Malchut, La Corona Real, written in the 11th century by Shlomo ibn Gabirol and translated by Carlos Moses Grünberg. This translation reveals inconsistencies, or what Henri Meschonnic calls teratologie or anomalie, such as omissions, additions, and displacements. The version strikes me as experimental or perhaps an unfinished draft, particularly when compared to the outstanding 1962 version by the Spanish translation Rafael Cancino's Sens, on which we heard a few minutes ago with Nicolas Magarit. What I would like to highlight in this case is Grünberg's rendering of Ibn Gabirol's voice through rhythm, transforming lyrical prose into a free verse lyric form. Similar to Meschonnic's reading of the Pentateuch as acoustic poetry, Grünberg interprets Ibn Gabirol's text as a dramatic monologue addressed to God, structured through a rhythmic chain of interrogations and arguments. This approach requires interventions in Spanish syntax, producing inverted sentence structures and, more broadly, disrupting the traditional Spanish poetic voice. The questions I have raised regarding Grünberg's use of neologisms, archaisms, Kyle translations, etymological renderings, and the possible inclusion of Judeo-Spanish terms still call for deeper analysis. They prompt me to consider not only the extent to which the Neo-Sephardic poetics of Grünberg's poems and biblical Haggadic translations shaped his Spanish versions of the Jewish corpus in European languages, but also how his work as a translator may have influenced his own poetic production. In conclusion, placed in context, Carlos Moisés Grünberg's polyglot and translatological work clearly constitutes a form of intellectual resistance to fascism in Argentina, articulated through two simultaneous and interrelated strategies that both pursue the same aim, the Judaization of readerly consciousness, a project that also shapes his own self-positioning as a Jewish poet. The first strategy is rooted in domestication, as defined by Lawrence Venuti, Grünberg translates contemporary Jewish texts, such as the essays of Daniel Pasmanic and Yehuda Magnes, into accessible, reader-friendly Spanish, attentive to local idioms and cultural references. These translations function as communicative acts designed to integrate Jewish ethical and political discourse into the broader Argentine intellectual landscape. Concurrently, Grünberg employs a counter-strategy of foreignization through the creation of Neo-Sephardic texts, works that deliberately foreground Hebrew intertextuality, idiomatic expressions, and linguistic structures drawn from liturgical and classical sources. These texts serve as acts of epistemic resistance, refusing the erasure of Jewish knowledge systems and memory amid the pressures of anti-Semitic and genocidal ideologies. His use of marked, non-standard forms resists assimilation and asserts a counter-hegemonic voice that affirms the continuity and vitality of Jewish cultural identity. The versatility suggests that from Grünberg's perspective, Jewish translation was conceived as a literary genre in its own right, with its own rules, tools, and aesthetic possibilities, developed against the grain of dominant European translation paradigm, which regarded translation primarily as a transparent mode of communication rather than as a form of writing in its own right. In this same spirit, Henri Meschonnic, writing at the close of the 20th century, wrote in Poétique du traduire, revaloriser la traduction implique qu'elle soit une écriture, sans quoi c'est une imposture. That's it. Thank you for your attention. So, we have time for, do we have time? We will make time for a few questions if you have, and I hope I don't want to talk anymore, please. Please, you can open your mic because we are at the end of the event, so feel free to ask or comment questions for Sarah, for Beatrice, or for me.
If I may, I have a question for Beatrice about. Je peux vous faire la question en français si c'est plus facile.
D'accord.
Et en fait, je voulais savoir si, s'il parle des théamimes aussi par rapport à sa théorie de rythme et l'idée de ta'am comme un rythme de vie et un peu comme un cycle plutôt et d'une question rythmique de qu'est-ce que c'est la vie juive en gros, c'est-à-dire comme cycle humain et pas seulement dans la vocalisation physique, mais avec les idées de, en fait, the music of the spheres, la musique et un peu néoplatonique et ces questions qui parlaient aussi des rythmes et des cycles divins et par rapport au mouvement, mitzvot, voix et comment le ta'am il recoupe sur ça.
Oui, je pense véritablement que oui, que c'est véritablement la base à partir de que les théamines ont été véritablement la base à partir de laquelle il a formulé sa théorie du rythme et que déjà sa conception que le rythme n'est pas une métrique. Hein, c'est pas juste des accents réguliers, irréguliers, comme on peut le lire dans des théories du vers. Donc, il abandonne complètement la théorie ou la conception de la régularité pour privilégier véritablement la conception du rythme comme mouvement de la parole. Et je pense qu'effectivement, il y a un lien très clair avec les théamimes, même s'il ne parle pas explicitement des théamimes comme cycle. Ça, c'est quelque chose que je n'ai pas explicitement en tête, ni dans la poétique du traduire, ni dans l'éthique et politique du traduire, mais l'idée que les théamimes, c'est bien plus que justement euh, une régularité. Je crois que c'est que les théamimes sont mouvements, que les théamimes définissent le texte, que ignorer les théamimes, c'est quelque part passer complètement à côté du sujet du texte. Tout ça, cette conception-là a véritablement marqué ces conceptions traductives. Et les théamimes deviennent, parce que Henri Meschonnic n'a pas uniquement traduit la Bible, il a traduit par exemple aussi les poèmes de Shakespeare. Là, c'est exactement le même principe. Naturellement, il y a pas de théamime dans les sonnets de Shakespeare, mais ce qu'il veut véritablement traduire, c'est le mouvement de la parole, avec tout ce que ça implique. Pas uniquement le vers, pas uniquement les rimes, mais véritablement toutes les composantes du mouvement de la parole. Donc, toutes les composantes du mouvement de la parole, ça veut dire par exemple tous les effets d'écho. Hein, quand les répétitions, certaines voyelles qui apparaissent au début du sonnet et qui réapparaissent à la fin du sonnet. Donc, je crois véritablement ce que vous dites là, et je trouve que c'est vraiment une question très, très, très intéressante, que cette idée de devoir traduire, parce qu'il construit sa conception selon une éthique. Donc, l'idée de devoir traduire le rythme vient véritablement de sa propre traduction des théamimes. Oui, donc les théamimes sont pour lui euh, le symbole même du mouvement de la parole. Les théamimes modélisent la parole. Modélisation, c'est aussi un mot qui revient. Donc oui, oui, j'ai envie de répondre par l'affirmative. Les théamimes sont véritablement à la base de sa théorie traductive, sont la représentativité de ce qu'est le mouvement de la parole. Et puis, à partir de là, à partir de cette expérience traductive de la Bible, il va transposer cette expérience du rythme sur d'autres textes littéraires, comme par exemple les sonnets de Shakespeare.
Merci.
Merci à vous.
please.
Merci à vous.
Hi.
Yes, go on, please.
So thank you. This is great. My question is about calc translation, and I saw that in both Sarah and Cynthia's talks. The idea of translating word for word in a prayer context makes sense because it's poetic, and the language of prayer tends to be different from the language of spoken language in general. But in a literary translation, it would serve a different purpose. I mean, I guess it serves different purposes for pedagogical text as well. Like, the tradition of translating Bereshit in Ladino, you had an example, but it wasn't exactly the same as the calc translation of in principio crió el Dios a los cielos y a la tierra, that a reflecting the et in the Hebrew original. And so my question is just about the interplay between pedagogical intent and poetic intent, and highlighting the sacredness, the sacredness of the Hebrew language, the Hebrew original text. And so I guess that's for Cynthia or Sarah.
Do you want to answer, Sarah, before?
Yeah, I can say something briefly. I think it's such an interesting question. One thing that immediately comes to mind, which I haven't included thus far, is the question of interlinear prayer books and how translation in interlinear prayer books kind of creates an artificial language because of its pedagogic function. For me, the question that stands out is the function of the translation. So what you're pointing out with the kind of verbatim calc English, which therefore creates a kind of an artificial English. On the one hand, it speaks to what I'm going to call the kind of art scroll movement of here's the translation so that you can understand what you're saying when you're praying in Hebrew. Like their intention is not to create a language of prayer in English, but it does lead to a very non-standard English word order, at least, if not word choice. Versus on the other end of the spectrum, the books which self-consciously state we are writing English prayer. The translation here is a language of prayer. It's not Hebrew text and translation. It's two parallel liturgies. And maybe the question of verbatim word orders and calc translations is one of the interesting bridging kind of linguistic tools or modalities. So I definitely need to go there more. But thank you for raising it for sure.
Regarding the Grünberg translation, well, the answer is double. From one side, there is this passion for philology and Hebrew roots and the translation itself and language in general. From the other side, it's a political vindication because he's translating all these texts towards the end of the Second World War, and he's terrified and he's angry, and it is really a period where his Jewish person becomes not only a writer but also a translator. So there is, I think, the aim is to be politically Jewish, not only identity from an identity perspective. So his text, it's actually not contemporary Spanish. It's what I call a Hebrew Spanish or a Neo-Sephardic Spanish. It's not a text that a typical Argentinian could read. It's really a great invention, I would say.
Yeah, and just one more thing, Dara Horn talks about that in her English, about her English writing, that she writes novels for English-speaking people, and Jews will see reflections of the Hebrew in it, where people who don't have that Jewish education would just see weird wording. Even the titles like The World to Come and In the Image, Jews immediately know what that refers to in the Hebrew original. So it's kind of like coded language in a sense.
I guess there's an interesting point there, which I've also started thinking about, which is what are the aspects of a Jewish language which might still be mutually intelligible to non-speakers of that language, but which mean more to those who live within the Jewish world. So, for example, for me, that's the difference between transliterations, which really might mean very little to somebody who doesn't have the Jewish communal or Hebraic experience, versus word orders like blessed are you, which immediately are encoded for those who exist in a Jewish prayer space, but are obviously intelligible to standard English speakers. So I think it's like a really interesting space to be in when we're thinking about what defines a Jewish language.
Gilad, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I have a question for you, Sarah, to continue our conversation from yesterday. have you encountered or can you imagine Siddur, bilingual or not, that's written entirely in English rather than Judeo-English?
You mean the translation is all in English? You mean a bilingual Siddur where the translation is standard English?
Yes.
It's one of the few aspects of my study where I've seen a real diachronic trend throughout the time of the corpus. So I'm studying books from 1940 to pretty much the present day. And I do think there is a significant change over time, both chronologically and also geographically. So earlier books are more likely to exhibit standard English, and also British books, British published books, as opposed to American published books, and also denominationally, so Orthodox publishers, as opposed to Reform or Conservative Reconstructions. And I think that's to do with this question of the function of the translation. So so I can think of some books from, kind of the 50s and 60s. Maybe one of the most classic examples is the British Orthodox, often called the Singer's Prayer Book, the Authorized Daily Siddur, which has many, many editions with many translators. But the kind of 40s and 50s publications of that book, they translate every example of Torah as law, every example of Shabbat as Sabbath. So in terms of loan words and transliteration, they have virtually no trace of Jewish English. But in terms of word order and conventions, they still are using kind of verbatim word orders like blessed are you, which are really quite unusual in standard English. That wouldn't be a normal word order. So I don't know if I would say it's 100% standard English, but it's definitely kind of I think we need to see it as a spectrum, and this I obviously learned from the wonderful Sarah Banor, who's in the Zoom with us, that the idea of the spectrum, how much of the linguistic repertoire is being used. It's not, is it a Jewish language or isn't it? It's what percent, kind of what extent of the linguistic repertoire is being used. But yeah, definitely diachronic shifts and ideological differences, and geographic as well. So it's an interesting piece of the research, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, so we did it. We went through these 2 very intense days that for me were really enriching, interesting, reveladores, I will say directly in Spanish. So I would like to close. I was hearing and writing all the time. All of you spoke. I also heard your questions, and I wrote a short page. So don't worry, that's not so much. But the idea was to summarize what you said, but also my ideas about it. So I would like to share it with you. And then I will have a few words really just to close with this, but don't worry, this won't be too long. So the workshop examined translation not merely as a linguistic operation, but as a cultural, political, and epistemological practice at the core of Jewish literary production and transmission. What emerged was a complex picture of Jewish translation as a layered semiotic act, one that enacts, reframes, and resists through language. At the center of this discussion stood the figure of the Jewish translator, not as a transparent mediator, but as a polyglot cultural agent, shaped by multilingual environments and often operating across dissonant linguistic registers. The translator becomes both a subject of history and a producer of it, carrying out an embodied practice that is at once textual and political. Throughout the sessions, translation was approached as a space of negotiation between vernacular and sacred languages, between major and minor traditions, between preservation and innovation. The recurring motif of multilingualism, not as a stable repertoire, but as an unstable heteroglossic field, complicates any singular notion of linguistic fidelity. Translation strategies such as foreignization, Judaization, hybridization, and even Laicization were shown to be ways of reterritorializing the Jewish text within shifting historical and political coordinates. The question of how to translate multilingualism from one historical moment into another remains critical, especially in relation to the dense, stratified language words of pre-war Yiddish or Ottoman Judeo-Spanish. Some translations replicate this multiplicity through transliteration, code switching, and accentual layering. Others engage in what might be called acoustic translation, where prosody, rhythm, and sound patterns are foregrounded as carriers of cultural memory. In these practices, translation is not only textual but sonic, charged with the task of restoring or reinventing sublimated resonances. The discussions return often to the relation between hermeneutics and translation, challenging the assumption that translation follows interpretation. Instead, translation itself can shape the interpretative horizon, thereby modifying or distorting philosophical and political readings, both of traditional and contemporary text. The concept of post-vernacularity offered a further framework for thinking about the afterlives of Jewish languages. Languages no longer fully spoken, but reactivated through literary and translational performance. In this context, translation becomes a mode of cultural survival and a site of aesthetic experimentation. It lately materialized through metafictional genres as a reflection on the relation between endangered authors, translators, and languages. Finally, the workshop reflected on the ambivalence between preservation, transformation, and adaptation through translation. Jewish translation vibrates between diverse dimensions of Judaization and hybridization, producing idioms such as Castidish, Judeo-Franiol, or ephemeral registers like the one Susana Skura called as Tehuelchish, markers of the porousness of linguistic and cultural borders. These hybrids testify to what might be called as, thank you, Leo Sengman, as a Jewish glossolandia, a speculative territory where translation is not merely a tool, but the very grammar of Jewish cultural existence, plural, unstable, and generative. This vision underscores the inescapable relationship between theory and practice in translation, as emphasized by Henri Meschonnic, and insists on confronting translation as a mode of writing in its own right, rather than a derivative or secondary operation bound to a pre-existing text. That's it for the moment. Thank you so much for everything you said. I took notes and it was really interesting. I just want to remind you that we have our blog where our network continues to publish your texts, because the blog is open for everybody. So I really hope you will feel the need and the joy to publish through the blog, through Jamanes y Poligloterías, through Hamans and Polyglotteries. We receive short text, and we are open to short essays and translations in any language related, of course, to the Jewish experience. You have our mail, JewishTranslation@gmail.com, and I would like to offer you the possibility of thinking of a shared volume to be published multilingually. I hope it won't be easy to find a publisher ready for that, but I'm sure we can do it. So I will write you maybe in a few weeks about it, and you will tell me if you are interested, and we will think together if this is a possibility. So if someone wants to say something, I'm really happy to be in a dialogue and not in a monologue. So please feel free to talk. Okay. Thank you very much, Maia Avruj. She was there all the time, and she really, I really have to thank you, Maia, because I think everything was perfect and very interesting and technically work very well. And thank you so much to all of you. And I hope to see you around and maybe write together and hopefully in the future renew this invitation and organize a new workshop with you. So see you soon. Thank you.